Okay, so I'm carrying on now with my discussion about tariffs and quotas. So the red curve is a domestic supply curve. So what this basically means is in this curve is sort of capturing the manufacturers, the producers of cars. So in our case, like General Motors, Ford, and so on, collectively. Okay, so this is a collection of all the amount of cars that manufacturers, Canadian, the actual domestic Canadian manufacturers, wish to supply or produce, basically. You'll notice it's upward sloping. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. What it basically says is, as the price rises, then of course the Canadian car companies want to produce. They would like to produce a lot more cars, and this is just common sense, really, right? Because obviously, as the price goes higher and higher and higher, then they're going to make, it's better for them. They like that, right? They're induced to produce more cars, right? Higher, if they can get a higher price for their product, right? So this is a good thing, and also they're also concerned about rising costs as well. A lot of it, they're kind of concerned that as they produce more and more and more, the costs start going up, so they need to capture higher prices and so on. But so anyway, so this basically captures. So that means they're willing to produce more if they get higher prices to help offset the higher costs and so on. So maybe basically the common sense is that as prices go up, firms want to supply more stuff, and as prices go down, they don't want to produce as much. Okay, so that covers the domestic supply curve. Okay, then we have, if you look at the first graph, the one on the left, you have this thing called PW. What's that? Well, P, of course, stands for price, because it's on the price axis, right? So it's P for price. And the little subscript W stands for world. Now, your textbook on page 608, chapter 18, talks about the law of one price. Okay? And so, according to the law of one price, what it says, or the definition of it is when a product which can be cheaply transported, around the world, is traded throughout the entire world, it will tend to have a single worldwide price. And basically, as your book points out correctly, is that if you're basically selling the same product and it's, let's say, a lot cheaper in one country than another country, and there's really very little transportation cost to move things around across borders, then obviously people will buy more from the cheaper place and less from the more expensive place. So the idea is that eventually prices all converge. So that's what this world price basically means, is that in this scenario, when a product can be cheaply transported, maybe that's not maybe cars aren't the best example of cheap transportation, but let's just pretend they are. And that's what you're going to have to do, is pretend with me, right? And it's traded throughout the world, so what they're saying is we can ship the cars anywhere, let's say. Then they all tend towards a single price, this worldwide price. Maybe a better example would have been commodities, right? There's one price of, let's say, corn or something like that, commodity, maybe oil. One price sort of across the board that everyone has to pay everywhere in the world. That's what they mean by this world price. There's one price for everyone. And that this law of one price says that no one really, this is sort of what it basically comes from, is that there's sort of like a big world demand curve and a world supply curve, and then they find the equilibrium point, which supply equals demand, and so that becomes sort of the price that is set. And what we're also assuming is that Canada is so small in the grand scheme of things that is a price taker. In other words, this world price has been set, and there's really nothing Canada can do about it. Right, so Canada changing its output of cars and so on is not going to change the world price. It's sort of taken as a given. The world has said this is the price, and because Canada doesn't have is in this sort of hypothetical world, is small in terms of its influence on these sort of supply and demand, world demand functions, that it's not going to change the price. So we take it as given. That's why in the free trade picture, the one on the left, it's a perfectly horizontal line, meaning that it's never going to change. It's just we take whatever the world price is as sort of a fixed value. Okay, so yes, the other one, if you look on the bottom of this graph, you have the little Q's. So those are just capturing quantities. Okay, so Q for quantity, so that's no big deal. If you look on the right-hand graph, the one with the restricted trade, we have PD, right? P again is for price, and the D is domestic. So this is like if you walk into a store, that's going to be the price that you see on the product, the domestic price. And then finally on that right-hand graph, the restricted trade graph, you see a T, and that is basically capturing the tariff. Okay, it's basically a tariff of like T dollars per unit. Okay, so in other words, the idea being that, I mean, basically, like if you look at this and you think of the world price as $10. Let's say so PW becomes $10. You think of a tariff as $2 for each unit. So then now the price is going to be, the sticker price is going to be $12. So the price goes up by the amount of the tariff. Okay? So hopefully I can squeeze in the free trade one in my remaining time in this clip. What we see here is we see a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. These are domestic, so it's domestic demand, what Canadians want to buy, and the domestic supply curve is what Canadians manufacturers want to produce. Now you'll notice that the world price is below the intersection of the supply and demand curve, right? Where the supply and demand curve cross is sort of the market equilibrium. But as you'll see, the world price is lower. Okay, it's lower than the price that would exist where the demand curve and the supply curves are cross, where they cross like this, right? Okay. And so then what they do, what this graph is telling you, is that the first we look at QO, the Q0, which is off the supply curve. That's telling us that the domestic producers only want to produce that Q0 amount of cars. So the Canadian car manufacturers only want to produce Q0. Now again, Canada has to take this world price in this scenario. So if we read off the demand curve, we see that domestic demand is Q1. Okay, so basically what this is saying is that demand is bigger than the supply. This is like saying Canadians want to buy, 10,000 cars, but Canadian producers are only producing 1,000 cars. So the difference between the two, the gap between Q1 and Q0, right, somehow has to be filled. Right? Domestic producers are not producing it, they're not supplying it, so the solution, of course, is that's your imports. So in other words, the total demand for cars is Q1. That first little bit up to Q0 is provided domestically, and the big gap in the middle is the amount of cars that have to be imported. I'll make another clip momentarily on the restricted trade situation.